Hi, Rod. Welcome back to 10 by 6.
Hi, thanks for having me on again.
Our pleasure as usual. This week, we're making the transition from what we've been looking at in recent weeks, which is about the way in which Western countries and wealthy countries have constructed this paradigm that poor countries should be dependent and that they should look to aspire to the way in which the economic systems in the West have been developed. And we found a lot of rotten fruit under that tree. And this week, we're going to continue with that investigation by looking at the intentionality of the rich countries to move as much wealth in a whole range of forms from poor countries into those wealthy rich countries. So it makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. And one of the ways in which you're going to explain how they do that is the imposition of neoliberalism upon those poorer countries. Over to you, Rod.
Thanks very much. That was a great introduction. So yeah, we're going to look at a number of related areas, which will give sort of viewers and listeners an understanding of how it is that wealth gets transferred from poor countries to rich. And whilst we're doing it, we're going to debunk one or two of the sort of main theories that are, if you've ever had the misfortune to go and study mainstream economics at university, you'll have had these things rammed down your throat. And whilst they sound wonderful in an economics textbook, in the real world, they're complete nonsense. And so we're going to look at those. So in fact, we're going to begin with one of those. So there's a theory that some of you may have heard of, which is called comparative advantage. Now, we're not going to look at any of the technical aspects of this. When this is taught in universities, they draw lots of graphs and curves and lines, and they look at where the lines intersect and so on. And they say, hey, we've got this great theory that if each country just focuses on what it's really good at doing now, then that'll be a win-win for everybody. And it turns out that there's a lot wrong with this theory. So when it comes to poorer countries, they're essentially being told to focus in the things that they do well now, which tends to be either because they've got the right climate for growing certain crops for export, so that might be coffee, or they've got very low-cost labor. So they're encouraged to do labor-intensive tasks like making clothes and so on. So we're going to have a quick look at the sort of main problems with that theory. So what happens is that if poor countries are encouraged to focus on things that use cheap labor, what happens is they end up competing against each other to provide the cheapest labor. And Western companies will look around the world to find those countries that offer not only the cheapest labor, but also the worst working environment for subcontractors and for employees. So in fact, you do get what some people call this race to the bottom, where poor countries compete against each other to basically offer slave labor. And so that rather contradicts the idea that you see in the economics textbooks that by doing this, countries will become wealthier and wealthier. In fact, they don't get wealthier by doing this. So if you look at another reason why this theory is complete nonsense, if they're encouraged to grow a crop, they will tend to grow a single crop. So that could be coffee, they might grow cotton. Well, what happens is that the price of these basic commodities like coffee and cotton fluctuates up and down. And at various points in time, the price of these things has crashed through the floor. So those countries that were very dependent on it, selling lots of coffee, on selling lots of cotton, simply couldn't make enough money to cover their costs. So again, it was yet another example of people working essentially as slave labor. So there have been lots and lots of case studies. So for example, in the year 2000, two countries, Tanzania and Mozambique, their economy was very dependent on the sale of cashew nuts. But in that year, there was a price collapse of cashew nuts. And so they couldn't receive much money for growing all the cashew nuts. And in fact, even the World Bank, which is one of the main sort of international players who tries to encourage this comparative advantage system, has admitted that a focus on this sort of low-cost agricultural export strategy will not work to help countries become advanced nations. And it has multiple knock-on consequences. So, for example, in the past, a country like Indonesia was self-sufficient in rice production. It made enough, it grew enough to feed its whole population. But in fact, many of the rice plantations were cleared and they were replaced with palm oil plantations for export. And in fact, now there is malnutrition in Indonesia because they're not self-sufficient in the basic foods that they need. So what you find in the poorest countries is ultimately starvation and, in the worst cases, widespread death, where they have famines and so on, because they're so dependent on certain things where they're selling them now for export and they're not able to produce what they need for domestic consumption. And then, as well as selling something like coffee, some countries are dependent on selling something like oil or iron ore or copper. Well, again, the prices of those things fluctuate up and down all the time as well. So, for example, Chile was very dependent on copper exports for many years. In 1996, the price of copper fell through the floor. And again, Chile really suffered because of that. And some of you who followed the news more recently will have been aware that Venezuela is very dependent on its oil exports. And when the price of oil drops too low, then the people of Venezuela suffer because they're not able to earn enough money through selling oil. But the most important problem with the theory of comparative advantage is it's about what countries are good at doing now. If a poor country ever wants to become an advanced industrialized nation, then it is going to have to invest in equipment and training in order to be able to do the more complicated tasks that are required in any nation that wants to be an advanced industrialized economy. And if you're just focusing on what you can do now, which is growing crops or labor-intensive tasks, then that's the opposite of what you need to do to become an advanced industrialized economy. So it's actually propaganda. And we can see this if we look back through the declassified files over the last couple of 100 years. This recommendation to poor countries to do these very basic tasks was exactly the same as Britain recommended to the poor countries within its empire. And you can actually see conversations of senior people behind the scenes saying the whole purpose is to keep poor countries poor, to actually stop them developing. It's to block industrialization. And that is the same today in terms of the strategy of comparative advantage. So it looks good in the theory textbooks, and if you study it at university, you will be bombarded with these theories and lots of graphs and so on about how it's meant to be win-win for everyone. But in practice, that is not the case. It's just propaganda to justify maintaining this highly unequal status. So if we look at one very good example of this, various people have talked about the coffee industry for many years. And in fact, just over a decade ago, there was a documentary made called Black Gold, where they highlighted the fact that people growing coffee in developing countries were receiving very, very little money for the coffee they grow, even when companies such as Starbucks were making lots of profit selling the coffee as a sort of retailer. And so it turns out that in an industry like coffee, there are lots of different people making big profits. So they can be the processors, the packagers, the distributors, the shippers, other people involved in the transport networks, the financiers, the insurers, and the retailers. The one group of people who really aren't making very much money are the growers. And that's because powerful players, big companies in Britain, Europe, and America, so on, dominate the discussions about how this system is structured. And they ensure that they are able to take the profits by exploiting growers in developing countries. And in fact, this got so bad a few years ago that growers in Ethiopia gave up growing coffee in many parts, and they turned to growing other things. And the thing that is most profitable for them to grow is drugs. And so what we realize is that when we exploit people too much, they will end up doing things that then have unintended consequences for the rest of us. And so you get a much bigger global drug trade. And what's ironic is that I actually recalculated some of the numbers in terms of how much people who grow coffee receive. When the film Black Gold was made, for each cup of coffee that sells in Starbucks for, let's say, approximately £2.50, the growers would receive 4 cents for their coffee. Well, now the growers receive 1 cent for the coffee that goes into an expensive cup of coffee in the UK. So in fact, the incomes to the growers have plummeted. So there's a real sort of irony here. If you look in an economics textbook, they always talk about a theory of supply and demand. When there's great supply, that means prices will go up. Oh, sorry, when there's great, I say it's the wrong word, it's important to get this right. When there's a lot of demand, that means lots of people are drinking coffee, then the price paid to the growers should increase because demand drives up the prices. But in practice, demand for coffee is higher than it's ever been, and yet the prices being paid to the growers are the lowest they've ever been. And so you start to realize that these very nice simplistic theories in textbooks have no relevance in the real world. And it's because they completely overlook the complexity of the real world system, where the growers of coffee are not selling directly to the person who drinks it, but you've got many, many other people in the supply chain and lots of middlemen who can manipulate and control the system. So it's interesting, if you talk about something like coffee, people have noted that if we were to trade coffee in the same way that the French trade their wine, then coffee growers could actually earn a decent living. As well as growing it, they would process it, they would package it, they would distribute it, they would control some of the shipping systems and the transport systems, and they might also control some of the retail outlets and so on. So they could make a good living. But in fact, advanced nations, particularly the European Union, actually block poor countries from doing that sort of thing with their coffee and with their other basic exports. They do not want poor countries to take control of certain parts of the distribution system. So in fact, they impose penalties on imports that are not just the raw coffee. And there was a great example about 20 years ago where the World Bank helped Vietnam set up major coffee plantations. But in fact, that created a sudden increase in the amount of coffee that was available worldwide, and buyers were able to play off different countries against each other, and so the price plummeted. Now, in fact, there had been an organization of coffee growing countries, and they tried to control the prices a little bit to make sure the growers were paid a reasonable income. But in fact, when the World Bank helps extra countries like Vietnam to grow coffee, that undermined the agreements and the associations. So that association, which tries to keep prices a bit higher, no longer exists. Now, it's worth mentioning at this point, some people say, oh, what about fair trade? That's much better, isn't it? Well, fair trade is definitely an improvement on everything else that I would describe as extremely unfairly traded. But in fact, it probably isn't a long-term solution. All it means is that growers are getting a little bit more for what they're producing, but it's not the same as a country saying, hey, we want to have control over the distribution and the processing. And it's not the same as a country saying, we are going to invest to do more technologically advanced processes. So it is still a way, unfortunately, that countries are locked in to doing the things that are not worth very much, even if they do get a slightly higher income for it. But what a fair trade highlights to me is the breadth of stuff that we buy in this country that is unfairly traded. With nearly everything that you buy that isn't labeled fair trade, someone somewhere in the global supply chain is being exploited. And whenever you research any of the way the global supply chain works, you start to realize how many different places there are where people are being exploited. Now, getting around this would not be that difficult. At various points in the past, the International Labour Organization has talked about trying to create something like a global minimum wage. But of course, the major players in Britain, Europe, and America are not very keen. They like being able to exploit the developing countries, and they actually go out of their way to make sure that wages in the poorest countries are kept artificially low. So another area that I want to talk a little bit about today is outsourcing and sweatshops. So, for example, people in Bangladesh, which is one of the main centers for the production of clothing, which is sold in advanced nations, they'll be paid approximately $75 per month. That's approximately half of what's needed to live on. And you can see the same sort of thing in many other countries. So sweatshop conditions mean places where the workers have very few rights. So often they're subjected to violence. The buildings they work in can be incredibly dangerous. There can be fire hazards, there can be poisonous chemicals, and they can be forced to work very, very long hours at a moment's notice. And then other times they have no work for a short period, and they never know how much income they're going to get. So the most recent study I looked at was a few years ago, but it was suggesting that people in sweatshops are probably earning approximately 10 cents, that would be 10 American cents, for a shirt that will retail for approximately $80. So they're really only getting a tiny, tiny fraction of the true value of the clothes that they make. And there have been a number of examples that have made the mainstream press highlighting this. So most famously, there was a building called Rana Plaza a few years ago, which just collapsed and 1,100 people died. And then in 2010, there was an example where the computer company Apple outsources the construction of some of its components to a producer called Foxconn in China, and there were many examples of worker suicides because of the conditions where they were working. Now, my understanding is that has improved somewhat, but if you only ever study one example at a time, any company will always say, oh, well, we've improved. But actually, when you start to look in other countries, you realize they're still exploiting people everywhere. And so you start to realize that in order for ordinary people to get together in poor countries to say, we would like a better standard of living, historically, unions have been incredibly important. And one of the things that you don't see being discussed in the mainstream press very much is how much big companies from advanced nations actually fight against the existence of unions in poor countries. They do not want employees there to have any say or any control over their working conditions. So big companies are not passive. So if you see representatives of big companies issued about this, occasionally they will say, oh, well, the problem was with a subcontractor in Bangladesh or in China. We had no control over it. That's never the case. Companies always have influence over what's going on in their subcontractors' factories. So in fact, the companies are actively working. They're actively lobbying governments to keep pay and conditions very, very poor. Now, this situation has actually got worse in the last few years because the whole fashion industry has moved towards a model that they call fast fashion, where people will buy clothes, wear them once, discard them, and they'll see something in a shop and they'll see something on a catwalk and they'll want it soon. And so the whole sort of supply chain system in the fashion industry has really speeded up. So by all accounts, people are now wearing approximately 5 times as many clothes as they were about 20 years ago. And a huge amount of this is worn very rarely and then thrown away. So it's incredibly polluting, but also the system becomes more and more exploitative as subcontractors race to meet tighter and tighter deadlines imposed by clothing companies in advanced nations. So it's important to understand this whole idea of outsourcing to subcontractors overseas is not just about saving money. It is also very deliberately about avoiding accountability for the conditions of the people who make the clothes. And by outsourcing and then using a subcontractor and then a subcontractor, they can maintain secrecy about the conditions in their supply chain. So this is all very deliberate. Now, one of the arguments that people who are in favor of outsourcing and sweatshops, one of the main arguments they put forward is, well, what else would these people do? They're living in incredibly poor countries where it's very difficult to earn a decent living. That is sort of true, but it ignores the big picture. Why is it so difficult for people in that country to earn a decent living? And it comes back to all the things we've talked about earlier on in terms of the use of violence by America and Britain and Europe, and the use of other economic means to manipulate governments and politics and economics in poorer countries. And so what is happening is that we in Britain and America, or the politicians in Britain and America, are actively trying to make sure that poor countries have leaders who will maintain the existing system, who will keep huge swathes of their population in poverty. And if governments come along in other countries who want to try and end poverty, then Britain and America will actively work against them, try to overthrow them or to destabilize them. So there's a great case study of this with Bangladesh. So Bangladesh is one of the main countries where sweatshops operate and people are treated terribly. Well, America overthrew the leadership of Bangladesh in 1975 and imposed a military dictatorship. So that leadership prior to that point might have actually tried to improve the living standards of people in Bangladesh. America imposes a military dictatorship, and for the subsequent half a century, the country has actually been ruled by two family dynasties, both of whom like the system the way it is and want to keep the system the way it is, and who are supported by the United States government. And they have no intention of trying to end poverty or to end sweatshops and to end exploitation and so on. So we could come up with proper laws regarding corporate conduct if we wanted to, but there are too many powerful players in Britain, America, and Europe who actively work against this. Now, one of the things you might have seen in the last couple of years in the press is something called the Ethical Trading Initiative. And this is one of those things that every now and again, a group of companies will get together and say, we're going to do things better. But whenever anybody researches what's actually going on, they discover that actually it's just PR, that there are no sanctions on members of the Ethical Trading Initiative if they don't comply with the rules, and many of them do not comply with the rules. So it's a sort of self-regulation system which is intended to deflect attention from the need for much more serious regulation. Now, what we've seen, unfortunately, in the last few years in both US and Britain is something like sweatshops is starting to reappear here. So we see all sorts of different companies. It can be clothing companies, but it can also be companies like Deliveroo and Uber who try to manipulate the rules in terms of, say, pretending that people are self-employed when they're really employees. And they do that manipulation with the intention of trying to pay people below the minimum wage. And so this is now affecting quite a broad swathe of the lowest paid people in the UK, that powerful employers are trying harder and harder to exploit them. Okay, so that's a little bit about sort of a couple of economic ideas that you see in theory textbooks, but in the real world, it's all about maintaining exploitation. Now, the second half of today's presentation, I'm going to talk about third world debt. And this is something that, again, does crop up occasionally in the mainstream press. And it gets talked about for a little while, and some people will try to create some sort of initiative to write off some debts, and one or two politicians will jump on the bandwagon, but nothing long-term ever comes out of this. So the last time I checked the figures in 2020, there was a total amount of debt owed by developing countries of 11 trillion US dollars, having to pay interest of over $1 billion a day. Now, the figures are so big, it's hard to make sense of them, but that interest figure of $1 billion a day is many, many times greater than the total amount of aid that rich countries give to poor countries. So it's important to understand that the whole system is rigged to transfer wealth from poor countries to rich countries. And in fact, one researcher commented that the total amount of third world debt has already been repaid 6 times over, and yet still poor countries owe us vast amounts of money. And this is because of the way interest works over a long period of time, that a borrower can end up paying back a loan essentially forever if the interest rate is too high. So if we look a little bit about what the money that is lent to these countries is used for, we start to realize that maybe these countries should not be expected to pay this money back. So the most sort of criminal aspect of the way the system works is that advanced nations will lend money to dictators to buy weapons. And those weapons are either used to fight wars or they're used to repress their own population. Now, when those dictators finally lose power and the people get a more reasonable leadership in place, advanced nations who lent the money still expect that the people of that nation should pay the money back, even though they didn't benefit from the money at all. And in fact, there's a great example of this where money was lent to Saddam Hussein, the ruler of Iraq, who was an absolutely brutal ruler, fought multiple wars, repressed his people, murdered his people, and still advanced nations expect the people of Iraq to pay back the money that was lent to Saddam Hussein. Similarly, money that was lent to the genocidal dictator Suharto in Indonesia, again, advanced nations expect the people to pay that money back. And oddly enough, I came across a study that looked at 3 countries. That was Iraq, Panama, and Vietnam. And advanced nations were still expecting them to pay back debts, even though those countries were on the receiving end of sanctions at the time. So there's real sort of hypocrisy and double standards about the way the whole system works. So the weapons trade is one of the most criminal aspects of the system that creates all this international debt. If we look at what else the money that is loaned to poor countries gets spent on, there's a lot of research that's looked at what are called white elephants. So those are enormous projects that are of little value. So nuclear power plants that get built 20 years behind schedule, cost many times their original estimate. In total, there have been over 45,000 dams that have been built in developing countries. It's the construction of all those dams has displaced over 50 million people, and yet those dams in total produce much less energy than was originally predicted. And there was one case that I came across, the South American dam. The estimated cost was just over $3 billion. The final cost was $21 billion. And it was, some researchers have described this as the largest fraud in the history of capitalism. And what's interesting is a lot of that money that appears to be lent to developing countries actually doesn't go to the developing countries at all. It goes straight into the pockets of companies in advanced nations who are building the dams, and they're providing the expertise, and they're providing consultancy services. So in fact, a lot of money never reaches the poorest countries in the first place. And then the final problem with many of the contracts for these energy systems is that the contract for the energy itself, once it's being produced, often requires that the governments of these countries pay enormously over the odds for the energy, and the company that's running the energy supply, let's say the nuclear power plant or the dam or whatever, is still a Western company. So the money is still being extracted from poor countries to rich for many years after these systems have been built. And then last week, we started talking about the idea of capital flight, where very rich people who run a country steal the wealth of the nation and stash it in private bank accounts. And I came across a great case study on Nigeria. And it's estimated that Nigerian dictators have stolen a total of 120 billion US dollars since 1960. And all of that is money that should have belonged to the nation. And I came across this great quote: of the money borrowed by African governments in recent decades, more than half departed in the same year, with a significant portion of it winding up in private accounts at the very banks that provided the loans in the first place. So you start to realize that the whole system is rigged in multiple ways. So one of the best critical economists, a guy called Michael Hudson, has pointed out that many of the loans that poor countries have borrowed has been denominated in currencies that are not their own. So usually it's US dollars, it could be euros, it could be sterling. But in fact, these countries should never be borrowing in a foreign currency because the exchange rate can fluctuate so much. It can massively increase the amount that they need to repay. But also the interest rate on these loans can vary. And in the past, interest rates have been astonishingly high. There was a period in the 1980s when interest rates on nearly all international loans went up close to around 20% and 20% per year, and in some cases even higher. And what you start to realize is that countries cannot pay that level of interest. And so what happens is the amount of debt owing just increases and increases. So various people have pointed out that developing countries or poor countries have transferred enormous quantities of coffee, cocoa, cotton, cobalt, gold, oil, and diamonds, far, far more than should be necessary to provide the repayment of all their debts. But in fact, they still owe vast amounts of money. And so the case study in Nigeria that I was looking at, somebody said, we borrowed $5 billion, we've paid back $16 billion, but we still owe $28 billion. And you start to realize the whole thing is just like a fraud. It's just a shell game. The idea that is that advanced nations want to keep extracting as much wealth from developing countries as they possibly can. Now, when most people talk about loans, they think that it's all about money. And in a very simple sense, that is what loans are about. But internationally, there's another element to loans that is just as important as the payment of money. And that is about the conditions that are imposed on loans. And the idea is, we've talked about certain economic policies in previous sessions. So we've talked about the idea of privatization, we've talked about austerity, and we've talked about deregulation. And those are the three main sets of policies that we group together and call neoliberalism. Well, one of the things that poor countries have to agree to when they borrow money is that they will implement neoliberalism. Now, there's a slight irony to what sometimes happens next, in that sometimes advanced nations will say, oh, well, you owe us lots of money, we'll write off that loan. But in order for us to write off that loan, you have to implement neoliberalism. And so you start to realize that the debt is just this tool to manipulate the economies of poor countries. So whether they're receiving the money as a condition or whether they're having a debt written off as a condition, they have to impose neoliberalism. So it's ultimately all about manipulating the poorest countries to impose economic systems that benefit advanced nations. So you start to realize, if you look at something like austerity, the people who do these negotiations at the highest levels, and this can include people in the European Union, they're much more interested in the rights of bankers and investors than they are in the health of populations overseas. And in fact, we saw this in advanced nations over the last few years. So Greece particularly, but also Portugal, Ireland, Italy, and Spain, they've all suffered at different times with quite severe austerity, which has had very serious consequences for the poorest people in those countries. And the focus is always on ensuring that banks and investors keep getting their money back. The idea that internationally we should just write off many debts is something that the most senior people in advanced nations really don't want to engage with. And yet, interestingly enough, a number of academics have done a lot of research in the history of writing off debts. So Michael Hudson, I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's another one, his surname is Graeber, and both of them have written about the history of debt, and they've both pointed out that actually writing off huge debts, like the whole debt of a nation or of a whole population has been a standard thing throughout history, because leaders have realized that eventually debt gets to a point where it limits the ability of a society to progress. It sort of strangles the society and the economy. So the propaganda on debt is very, very powerful. I'm aware that if I talk to ordinary people about debt, every single person I ever meet, pretty much, who's never studied this stuff, always believes that the responsibility is with borrowers to pay back the money, and they have to go to extreme lengths to do that. The idea that the banks and the lenders should carry some responsibility is something that they've never considered. What people forget is that when banks loan money to borrowers, the banks make astronomical profits from this process. It's not them lending out of the goodness of their own hearts, being nice to some poor person who needs it. They are doing it to make money. So it would actually be just fine if we had systems where we wrote off debt much more frequently when borrowers are struggling, particularly in relation to international debt. Okay, I think that's probably a good time to open it up for a discussion.
Thank you so much, Rod. It's so hard to get my head around all this information. And again, I've made copious notes that will only scratch the surface and won't do justice to your presentation. But there are just a number of things that I'd like to discuss. Firstly, your starting point was very much around how rubbish economic degrees are.
Yeah.
And what I don't understand is that, I mean, like yourself, having done a number of degrees already, I'm confused that they don't have to analyze and evaluate the theories that they are presented with and are able then to be able to almost be forced to reach similar conclusions, or at least take on board similar conclusions as you've so articulately described.
I find the whole academic system so surreal these days, and it's a sort of parallel universe. So you've got the media, you've got the academics, and they spend very little time looking at evidence. They just have a certain set of beliefs, and that is what they teach. And strangely enough, in economics, at various points in the past, what they taught was completely different. And somehow we've managed, particularly over the last 40 years, to end up in a situation where everybody kind of worships this whole sort of neoliberalism side of things, everybody in academia. And they don't really question it, and they don't seem to take any real interest in looking at the real world data. And so the theory just exists in its own little niche. And as I perhaps mentioned before, so people like Noam Chomsky have talked about this many times, that it's taken as religious dogma, that it's like saying the earth is at the center of the universe. And you just sort of take that as a given and you never question it. And it doesn't seem to matter how much evidence comes out contradicting it. The people who've taught that theory for a while, they're very reluctant to say, yeah, I've been wrong all my life and everything I've taught is nonsense. So they find ways to justify the continuation of the same sort of teaching and so on. And I think perhaps I've mentioned before that some people say, only perhaps slightly jokingly, that you have to wait until a whole generation of people who believe in one set of ideas until they die off, or at least they retire. And then you might get a new generation of people coming through who will question this. But what is interesting is that in economics in other countries, they do teach a much more diverse range of kind of views and ideas, and are much more critical and so on. And it's very much a sort of US dominated thing that's expanded to include Britain, Europe, and a handful of other nations. And what's notable is a few researchers have looked at the role that American universities have played in training the future ministers of poor countries. And they have all of these scholarships where they invite people to come and study economics at the University of Chicago, which is notorious for being extremely neoliberal in its teaching, but other universities too. And then those people go back to their countries and eventually they become the finance minister of that country. And they impose these same kind of ideas and they buy into them. So the propaganda system through academia, which sort of spreads the message worldwide, is quite effective.
Yes. Yes, no, I get that. I understand that. It just seems to me that without the analysis and the evaluation, these degrees aren't worth the paper they're written on, unless, of course, the nature of economics now is very much about the quantitative, the mathematics, much more so than the intellectual skills required in order to deconstruct.
Absolutely, yeah. It has definitely moved in a mathematical direction, more so in some universities than others. And those people who are trying to look at the real world analysis and look at the relationship between economics and politics universally recognize that this move towards a more mathematical basis for economics is not a good thing, that there's too many mathematical models that have no real basis in the real world and so on.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the prices of coffee, cotton, and you talked about cashew nuts, oil, and a whole range of commodities. What role does the stock market play here? Because ultimately, we can talk about supply and demand, but at the end of the day, also it's about that casino style of money making that the stock market works on, where you predict and work on probabilities, etc. And then you jump out the boat when it's sinking, or you climb in the boat when it's being inflated, so to speak, and you try and make as much money out of that as possible. So can you just very, very briefly just explain the role of the stock market as well, please?
Yeah, so the stock market plays a huge role in these things, in that everything that we've talked about, so it can be coffee, it can be oil and so on, it can be traded in incredibly complex ways. And so in theory, you can sort of just go and buy some oil and you can sell some oil, but then you can also buy the right to buy some oil in the future, or the right to sell some oil in the future. And so they've come up with these incredibly complicated, they're called derivatives. And so it's a way of, if you've got some money to invest, if you just buy or sell oil, you might make a bit of profit, you might make a bit of a loss, but probably the amounts are not going to be massive. Once you start gambling with derivatives, then you can make much bigger profits, but at the same time you can make much bigger losses. So the gamblers who want to play on the stock markets really like these derivatives because of the possible profits they can make. But unfortunately, when you have large scale gambling on the derivatives, that also then affects the underlying price of the actual thing that you're buying or selling. And that's one of the things that causes the price to fluctuate up and down. And the price that people are bidding in the stock markets does have a reflection on the price that people will pay out in the real world. So they are connected. And if the price plummets in the markets, the price that the producers will receive will plummet. And so in one of the things that I researched, where I was researching the markets themselves and derivatives trading and so on, in 2007, there were food riots in many poor countries, simply because the prices of the basic necessities had actually gone through the roof. So ordinary people couldn't afford to buy them. And that was driven by gambling in the stock markets.
Right. Thank you. I think it's really important for the listener to hear the phrase stock market, because it does play such a key part in all of this.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I've made this point anyway, but you went on to mention it after I'd written it down. But it's the nature of capitalism, without doubt, requires the rich and the poor to coincide. because it's all relative. You can only have the rich if you have the poor. So therefore, it's beyond question that we need the poor to exist, because if a certain group of people are going to benefit from capitalism, you need another group of people who are going to be the losers, because they are the producers. Ultimately, they are the ones, the planters. They're the ones who spend day and sometimes in the night getting the coffee beans or the cotton, or digging for oil, or whatever they happen to be doing. So we mustn't lose sight of the fact that capitalism demands inequality, and thus, as a direct result, it demands global poverty.
Well, so I think there's a theoretical question which has never kind of existed in the real world about whether you could have a form of capitalism where even the lowest paid people were paid a reasonable amount, enough to live on. And this would go back to Henry Ford and his the factories where he made the Model T car, saying that he wanted to pay his employees enough that they would be able to go out and buy his cars. And I think you could create a form of capitalism where this was the case. But in practice, because of power imbalances, this doesn't actually happen.
Right, okay. But if you paid 8 billion people, and let's include children at this point, if you paid 8 billion people, or potentially those 8 billion people, a wage in which they can afford everything that they need, but not obviously everything necessarily that they want, you're still going to have populations then that are richer and can afford a lot more of what they want as well as what they need. But also it means that the cost to the consumer will rise if the cost of production rises, because that is the nature of supply and demand and capitalist theory. So to have 8 billion people all on a similar level simply doesn't work in capitalism. That's why we try to look for an alternative, and we've come up with one which is called socialism.
So I think with capitalism, you'll end up with some inequality. And the question is the degree, what is the minimum amount of inequality you could achieve under a capitalist system? And because no one's got anywhere close to trying to do this internationally, it's all kind of theoretical and slightly abstract discussions. But there's no reason why you couldn't turn every nation into a reasonably advanced nation that's industrialized and capable of producing all of the things that most people need, so everybody could have a home and so on, and without then necessarily being an underclass who are being exploited. But it's a theoretical idea. It's never been tried in practice.
Okay, so we'll leave it there, because obviously we can get into too complex and sophisticated discussion on that. The nature of how you described the debt of non-industrial countries, and the way in which politicians have used it as a tool to manipulate many countries, and even internally within their own countries, and we'll come on to the UK a little bit later. But you talked also about Chile and Venezuela, and countries that the US have spent decades trying to control, and have been able to attack the prices of the commodities that they value the most, that they depend upon the most, in order to force down the value of those commodities in and around election times, so that it puts huge amounts of pressure on the government that possibly the US would prefer didn't have power, and puts a lot more influence and ability for the opposition parties, which perhaps the US are backing, in order to gain that power. So it's a manipulation of the economics in and around the commodities in these countries that leads to the outcome that the US seek, for example.
I've never actually studied manipulation of export prices in relation to the timing of elections, and that sounds like something that would be really interesting to research. But there is no doubt that the US and Britain and other advanced nations do whatever they can, and they actually have an expression for it, to make the economy scream. So they do everything they can economically to make life miserable for people in poor countries when they're trying to destabilize a government. And the example that people cite the most is in the early 1970s in Chile, where they were trying to get their dictator Pinochet in power and to replace a much better government under Salvador Allende.
Yes, thank you. Taking that example and taking everything we've talked about, therefore, in terms of the political manipulation that coincides with global debt, how can we explain currently to British consumers how it's possible that our government allows Shell to make such huge profits whilst at the same time trying to justify huge price rises to the consumer for their energy?
Well, so I always find that any discussion about what governments can sort of justify and so on starts getting involved in smoke and mirrors. So ignore everything the government says. What they're interested in doing is helping the shareholders and the executives of Shell make a killing all the time, and that's the same kind of across the board. Certainly, most of the time, with the biggest, most powerful companies, that the government basically structures the economy primarily to work with the interests of the most powerful players, and that could be oil companies, and it could be tech companies, and so on. And everybody else is basically getting screwed all the time by all of these big, powerful players. And the government is going out of its way to make sure that people are getting screwed. So the government in Britain and the same will be true in America and any other advanced nation, the government could easily change policies to stop the big, powerful companies and the rich people exploiting everybody else. But they actively do the opposite. They actively do policies that mean that everybody else is finding life harder and harder.
And that links in, thank you, Rob, that links in also to the way in which these big corporations, as you identified, have sought to combat the idea of formulating trade unions in non-industrial countries for the reasons that you specified. And it comes back again to what we've talked about on a number of occasions, that the fact that these individuals must be in themselves, and we're talking to politicians, we're talking to CEOs, we're talking to directors, we're talking big, influential, powerful people that are actually doing this. They must be sociopathic or psychopathic. You cannot have that. You cannot put into place those practices if you have high degrees of empathy.
So I would agree with that. I think that we have created political and economic systems that encourage the most sociopathic people to rise to the top. And I think any ordinary person would find it very difficult to implement some of the policies. What's interesting, we've talked a little bit in an earlier session about psychology, and there are certain things such as distance and complexity where individuals feel sort of removed from the consequences of their actions. So it might well be the case that for many ordinary people, if they ended up in a boardroom surrounded by other people who are saying to them, look, we've got to do this, we've got to cut jobs there, we've got to do this, we've got to do that, and they never actually got out and saw the end results of their actions, that actually some of the population would be able to do those things, and there would be a kind of spectrum of people, and those with the least empathy would be more able to do these things. So I think size and complexity and distance, and the fact that they never actually go down on the front lines or walk around the streets and see the consequences of their actions makes it easier for people to do that. But I think your general point that we have we are putting the most sociopathic people at the top, and they're the ones making the decisions, is correct. And I think it's a very, very dangerous thing for society.
But I think also that we need to remember that it doesn't just start when they end up in the boardroom. They needed to have had a life experience where they've either been distant from what's going on, so they're not aware of it, or in fact they have intermingled in cities around the world and are fully aware of it, but just don't care.
So I'm sure many of the senior people really don't care at all. Certainly the ones that we see in politics all the time, the highest levels of either the British, American, at the moment online, I'm seeing a lot about the Canadian governments because of the truckers and so on. And I'm sure the highest people of these governments, they really do not care at all about ordinary people.
In terms of unintended consequences, you talked about how when the situation in terms of the wages, income for those at the bottom of the hierarchy becomes such where they have to turn to illegal means, and this as an example, obviously in terms of drugs. But one of the things obviously that comes out of that is the demand by big pharma for those drugs. So actually big pharma requires those, what you called unintended consequences. I would probably argue that from a macroeconomic political position, actually they're not unintended at all. They're very much intended because there's such a huge demand.
So you never know. So oddly enough, I've researched the history of the CIA and their relationship to growing drugs and so on. And you start to, as you say, you never know quite what's going through the minds of these people. And so it wouldn't be that surprising if they knew that some people turning to drugs was a sort of inevitable outcome of some of these policies, was something that some very powerful actors are perfectly happy with.
Yes, yeah, totally. Also, there's the empirical evidence that suggests that the commodities that have a longer lifespan, you know, obviously fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, it has a relatively short lifespan and it has to be sold on and consumed quite quickly, but others not so. And they're the ones that sometimes are, shall we say, clandestinely hoarded so that they can be pushed out into the marketplace to push prices down at any given convenient moment.
Are you talking about hoarded by governments of advanced nations?
I'm talking about, let's take oil, for example.
Yeah.
We're told sometimes that there's a shortage of supply for oil, and then suddenly that there isn't. We're given reasons why there's a shortage of oil, and yet those reasons haven't gone away when suddenly the supply of oil significantly increases. And you know, the research and the analysis has suggested that actually what they're doing is they're just hiding the oil, billions of gallons of oil, they're keeping it away from the marketplace, but then they're releasing it when they need to release it in order to affect the cost, the price.
I'd have to study that in a lot more detail. So there's been some very good research in relation to the production of oil. So this is the extent to which a country like Saudi Arabia controls how much is pumped and refined, and therefore how much is available in total. I haven't done any research into manipulation of the oil supply or any other supply sort of beyond that original production phase. So you may know much more about that than I do.
Well, it also links logically to derivatives. If you've got big players in the marketplace who know that there's going to be a commodity that's released, that's we've been told it is in a low supply, it also enables those particular individuals to make killings.
Absolutely.
And it comes back to the point you were making before about insider trading and how insider trading goes on all over the place. And yet it's only a certain number of examples that are highlighted to make it look like it doesn't.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's absolutely right. So I won't sort of comment on this point.
Fair
It's
enough.
not an area of expertise.
Yeah. About the level of exploitation, Rod, I would argue that within a capitalist system, the whole nature of the relationship between the means of production and labor is exploitative. It's the degree of exploitation, perhaps, that we should be considering, because it's just a fact that relationship exists of exploitation. But certain people in certain positions, those without legal protections, those without trade unions, those in those pre-industrial or non-industrial, I should say, countries that don't have, the protection of governments, etc., they are just being exploited more. And yet anybody who goes into the workplace anywhere is being exploited because they're not being given the true value of their labor.
So I think that's very true, actually. So oddly enough, when I'm writing, I tend to focus on the most extreme cases. When you're looking at the international system, there are so many glaringly obvious, really extreme cases, coffee and cotton production and so on,
Yes.
Buildings collapsing and people being exploited. So that it's an incredibly easy argument to make. And so I tend to stick with the stuff that I know that anybody will understand immediately. But I think you're right.
Yeah. But coming to the end now in terms of I've got so many points, but I'm not going to go there because you made them so well that I don't need to. But the idea that more than half of the money paid to Africa has ended up in offshore accounts is such a frightening statistic. And yet it's something that should be on the front page of every newspaper every day, so that people start to perceive other human beings in other places very, very differently than they've been conditioned to do so far.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we always sort of come back to is the fact that this is called elephants in the room, because the mainstream media just do not talk about this stuff honestly. And, a newspaper like The Guardian might once in a blue moon have an article about one of these things. But actually, the system is so unequal and so exploitative. It should be something that we're talking about every day. And I always think it's very interesting, if the media want to talk about something every day, if it's COVID, they can do it every day. If it's leaving the European Union, so Brexit, they can talk about it every day for years. But when it comes to the really important stuff, they hardly ever mention it. And I think it's a real problem with the mainstream media in Britain and America. And so I hope that by us sort of getting the ball rolling on some of these topics, we can get more and more people talking about them.
And to finish off, I think people are craving this information. After all, so many people watch EastEnders. They're used to being negative thrust into their lives. And it's a constant opportunity to be able to look at other people's lives that are fictional, but it helps alleviate the fact that their lives are also so bad. So it gives you that half an hour, 2 or 3 times a week, or whatever it is that EastEnders is on, for example, that people can look over there and say, oh, their lives are worse than mine. Yeah. And yet, if we gave this information out, forgetting about the obviously the corporate media and how they have absolutely no incentive to do so, but if we gave this information out, I think people are very much used to bad news. Bad news has dominated for at least the last 50 years in the way in which corporate media has worked. So telling people that over there things are really, really bad, and the reason they're really, really bad is A, B, C, D, E. It's not like they're going to spontaneously combust.
No, no. So I think the funny thing is, I think most people, there's a part of everybody's brain that does kind of already know some of this stuff. So our early presentations were on war crimes and so on. So everyone in Britain knows that Tony Blair, has committed some war crimes, and that we need to do something about the system. And lots of people at different points have seen on the mainstream press stuff about sweatshops or exploitation or international debt. So they kind of know it's there, but it's just not talked about in a way where there's a recognition that we need to work together to do something about it.
Yes.
They have an awareness of it in the background, but it needs to be a kind of policy discussion. And we need to drive ordinary people to want to have policy discussions about these issues.
Yes. And finally, our education system needs to really step up, because it's up to this point, it's really, really letting down so many people in the population to have the skills to be able to do so. Thank you so much, Rod. It's been absolutely amazing yet again.
Thank you once again for having me on.
Our pleasure. See you next week.
Yeah, see you next week.